Many of you know that we often robe our graduates. For those of you who know church history, you've probably heard of the investiture crisis, so I wasn't going to try to revive that problem by having a layman robe a bishop. Our next recipient and also our commencement speaker today, Dr. Robert Royal. Now, I can't or won't read any emails that I've received, Robert, so you needn't worry about that. But I shall introduce Dr. Royal, our inaugural St. John Henry Newman Visiting Chair of Catholic Studies, in a different way than just rereading his bio. For those of you who know Robert, the word prince often comes up. I've said this before, and I was thinking about it earlier this week. And I thought initially when I was going to introduce him, I could quote something clever from Machiavelli. And I actually started to contrive remarks around the passage about the lion and the fox. But that would fall flat. Robert doesn't wish to be feared rather than loved. I don't think Robert has anything to do with Machiavelli's prince apart from perhaps his intelligence and determination. I then thought perhaps a paragraph from Castiglione's description of the gentleman. In particular, I think of Robert as exemplifying the quality of sprezzatura, which is very hard to define, but it means something like the art of making care and effort artless, no matter how trying the circumstances may be. I don't have an ounce of this in me. If you think of Dr. Connell, he sort of exemplifies this. And so does Dr. Royal. That was closer, I thought, but it wasn't right. Then I thought, well, how about Edmund Burke's The Unbought Grace of Life? Again, I like that and all that it means, the spirit of the gentleman, the ability to defend tradition, learning, church, and beauty. That all fits Robert, and it was getting closer. But the unbought grace of life remains, at least for me, tinged with a kind of melancholic origin that laments the passing of an old order. And while Robert Royal is rare, I think he would think it a failure if his efforts over a dozen remarkable books and 40 years of writing and journalism were even suggested as doomed or never to bear fruit or inspire people. I believe that they will. In the end, perhaps I should just say this. Robert is our first visiting chair, our first St. John Henry Newman visiting chair. And this is one of his last moments here. And this saddens me greatly, but appropriately. For it's the sadness that comes when friends must part and go about their work in separate places. Robert has, as St. John Henry Newman himself said, a friend should, helped us by writing in word to know ourselves a little better, to know what we did not know, to better read and better understand the wants and feelings of man, to take comfort in good reading, and especially to think of the higher life and the brighter world that is above this one. And for that, we are truly grateful. And so on behalf of the fellows and the trustees of Thomas More College of Liberal Arts, I'm delighted, Dr. Royal, to bestow on you the degree of Doctor of Humane Letters, honoris causa, and I know you already have a doctorate, but I hope you appreciate that now you're armed and dangerous with this doctorate. So again, you honor us by the reception of this honor, Robert. I thank you deeply for all you have done over the past year in helping us launch this program. Dr. Robert Royal.
This is the perfect moment. Well, I have to say that I feel at a bit of a disadvantage coming after William Fahey's witty remarks. I feel like I would have to spend 4 years here at Thomas More College to understand a large part of them, which I'm not opposed to if I happen to have 4 years. You were fortunate to have him here. I also feel at a disadvantage because I'm coming after the bishop's wonderful homily this morning. I actually said to William, "Are you sure you want me to speak this afternoon? We could just replay the tape of what the bishop said this morning. It was so illuminating." I don't have any funny stories. I was actually confirmed on the day I was supposed to be confirmed. Though I do like a lot of the Stones. I'm glad that William didn't read that biography, although he still was overly generous. And I do have something to do with Machiavelli. My master's thesis was about comparing Machiavelli and St. Augustine. I was in favor of the latter more than the former. But those remarks were very generous, and I really appreciate them. If my mother were here, she would actually even believe those things. My wife is in the back, and she'll correct the record later. So, let me just thank William again, and everyone here at Thomas More College for this, inviting me to just speak to you this afternoon for this 2021 commencement. We initially actually hoped I'd be here last year at 2020. This is the 2021 commencement, isn't it? Last weekend, I gave the 2020 commencement at Assumption University in Worcester, Mass. And George Will, the famous political philosopher and journalist, the week before my graduation speech, gave the 2021 lecture. So 2021 came before 2020 at Assumption, and all I can say with Hamlet is the time is out of joint. And he didn't know the half of it. So thank you all who have made this year wonderful for me. Students, some of you were graduating. Others who I guess will be coming along quite soon. Colleagues who I enjoyed being with over this past year. And congratulations to the class of 2021, and your parents and your other supporters, because this was not an easy year to finish up. I read an article this morning saying that this whole year was a loss, it's forgettable. And if there's anything that this past year is going to be, it's not forgettable. We're all going to remember this forever. But you made it through. You made it through in difficult times, and probably one of the most difficult years in recent memory. Now, as we all know, COVID-19 has taken its toll on all of us. And there are things about it, as there are things about many things in our lives, that we probably will never understand. But I kept reminding myself and other people during this year that God does things, he even allows things to happen for a purpose. He intends some good, probably many goods, to come out, even of something as awful as this pandemic, even as something so mysterious and so troubling. And as I reflect on the past year, there are many good things that being forced to stay home did for me personally. One thing was that I actually stayed home because somebody in my line of work actually spends a lot of time outside of home, even outside of his office. And I think lots of us, out of necessity, rediscovered the private virtues of home. And that's a very serious benefit to have realized in a year like this. Despite all the troubles, despite being sort of jammed together and forced to face your family and other people for long periods of time, we began to understand some important things about the value of being at home. And also publicly, I think that the virus forced on us some new virtues as well. I mean, the usual commitments to work and to perseverance and affection for the people around us, but also, I have to say, a kind of a public patience and a kind of a self-examination that we've rarely been asked to develop before. And so the main question I'd like to put before you today, I suppose, is why did all this happen for us just now? I don't exactly know the answer to that myself, but I'd like to just present you with some reflections that may be of some help. Now, many of the people around us, of course, think that this is just the way things are, that there are plagues every 100 years or so, Or even worse, that somehow this is our fault because we have done something to nature. We've committed a sin against nature, which I think is preposterous, but some think it. Pandemics and plagues, as you well know, have at different times in history been thought of as obscurely connected to the divine in some way. And it's interesting to think about this. Those of you who have been to Rome, and I think a lot of us under this tent today probably have been, you've probably seen the statue of the Archangel Michael on top of the castle that is named after him, the Castel Sant'Angelo in Rome, and he's sheathing his sword. One of the other great things that we can mention today is that Pope Gregory the Great in 590 had encouraged prayers and processions through the city of Rome, and seems to have had a vision that the pandemic of his time was finally coming to an end as a result of those prayers. Now, whatever the truth of that legend, we all know from scripture and from philosophical reflection that such phenomena, such challenges to what we think of as what our normal life is, can actually be a healing influence in our lives. God's chastisements are not capricious or vindictive, but they're medicinal. And somehow, in a strange way, even a disease for us can be medicinal if we understand it in the right way. Now, the Tower of Babel was destroyed for a particular reason. It wasn't just that God was jealous or envious of the people who were building that tower, but it's because precisely he was trying to prevent what human beings are always trying to do, and that is build a stairway to heaven on their own, without God, without his help, under their own power. It's the usual human temptation to think that we are God. And I have to think that one of the benefits of this pandemic has been to shake us up from that hubris, from that belief that somehow we can control everything around us through our own science and technology. Now, the sophomores who were studying the Divine Comedy with me this year, because they couldn't go to Rome, know that one of the central things I like to emphasize about Dante's Divine Comedy is this idea of his that he calls the contrapasso. Somebody asked me if I was going to quote Italian today, and Patrick, I am. And the contrapasso, put in contemporary American terms, is that the punishment fits the crime, basically. In hell, it's eternally the case. In purgatory, it's freeing us from the evils that we've committed in our lives. And even in paradise, there's growth. There's growth in the soul because people are always able to go closer to God and be more illuminated by him. And so I asked myself this week, what might Dante have made of our moment and this worldwide pandemic that we're all now suffering with, which has really kind of reshaped the world that you graduates are now going to enter. And what does it mean for you to enter that world? I'd like to just talk a bit about this word commencement, because it's an odd word that we use for graduations. I think the first time I actually came across the word commencement in an academic setting was at my own high school graduation. Before that, the only time I'd even heard the word commencement, I did not grow up in a very literate household, was when some commander in a World War II movie would say, "Men, commence firing." And then, the guns would go off, and it puzzled me. How is it that commence means a beginning in one sense, and in another, it's kind of an ending of the 4 years that you've had, 4 wonderful years that you've had here at Thomas More College. So it's a tricky idea, and in an obvious sense, this is an ending, because as of tomorrow, you'll be set on another part of your life in the world. But as I'm sure all Thomas More College students come to understand, the end of your formal schooling is not the end of your schooling. It should not be, it should not ever be the end of the journey toward knowledge, virtue, wisdom, and God himself, of course. Neither should it be in the bureaucraties of the education world these days lifelong learning. That's far too superficial for what it means to commence after the kind of formation that you've had. And there's a wisdom in that older way of talking about this, what the anthropologists call this liminal moment, when you're kind of halfway through the door and you're not quite out of it yet. It's an end that is a beginning, and it's a beginning that's an end, and things can happen as you move into a different mode of life like that. Now, I want to warn you just against a couple of mistaken impressions. It's very common when people graduate from college these days to say, maybe your own parents have said this to you, now you're going to enter the real world. Well, you've always been in the real world. The real world that you've been in the last 4 years is the real world of being young adults who are studying things that will be important to them for the rest of their lives. And you're confronting some of the most important questions that any human being in any part of the world has to face. That world, that so-called real world, needs well-formed minds like yours. Well-formed minds, hearts, and souls, frankly. And the way that you have been formed by this engagement with great figures from over millennia of human history, who themselves were great minds, great hearts, and great souls, is a rarity. And you're fortunate to be able to take that with you as you go on to the rest of your lives. It's a very valuable perspective for you, and it's a very valuable perspective for the world that you will now enter. For starters, I've spoken of the way that the pandemic has put before all of us how to think about, how do we think about this odd challenge that this disease has placed in front of us. Now, one important way, of course, is to say that scientific it's a scientific and a cultural challenge, and it's an opportunity for us to use our minds to solve a practical question, this disease. And the development of the vaccines to counter COVID, despite all the ethical disputes that we are all aware of, I'm quite sure, is a real human achievement. It shows something that we can do even when we're put in very difficult circumstances. But like the builders of Babel, if we think that we're building our own way to paradise, even in our efforts at healing, we're in for a rude awakening. And perhaps one of the most conspicuous benefits of the pandemic is it's made us all more critical of this scientific technological paradigm, which has been good, but as we know, has also been quite confused publicly over the last months and years. We're told by the experts in that paradigm that we should listen to what they know, and there are true experts in many fields. I don't want to add to the general distrust of authorities that exist, both authorities in the church and in the world, and that's in itself has become another kind of plague among us. But you'd have to be blind not to have seen during this past year that experts can be all too impressed with their expertise, which they think gives them a right to dictate to us, and yet as they begin to apply this expertise, there's chaos, there's confusion, there's contradiction, counterclaims by various experts and public authorities how to deal with the virus. And then there's also been a kind of an arrogant mockery of people who are skeptical of this confusion that they've been presented with. And we're urged to follow the science, because otherwise we're going to be those uneducatable Christians who resist truth. Now, for me, I think the benefit of this, too, has been a kind of a revelation of a certain Enlightenment haughtiness towards religious traditions and other human ways of understanding that have been too often accepted uncritically in recent years in the public square. I think in this regard of that short poem by William Blake, that's the best rebuttal of that attitude that I know. And let me just read it to you. I'm sure many of you know it already. Mock on, Voltaire, Rousseau. Mock on, 'tis all in vain. You throw the sand against the wind, and the wind blows it back again. And every sand becomes a gem reflected in the beam divine. Blown back, they blind the mocking eye, but still in Israel's path they shine. The atoms of Democritus and the Newton's particles of light are sands upon the Red Sea shore where Israel's tents do shine so bright. Now, you may notice that Blake's grasp of the science toward the end is a little iffy, but he knows. He knows that absent the larger kind of perspective that you have had studying these 4 years here at Thomas More College, that scientific technological paradigm, but that mocking paradigm towards anything else is a desert. It's a desert that has an absence of a larger perspective that we get from our scriptural and philosophical and properly human inheritance. Now, well-formed minds like yours, I'm sure, but I'll encourage you, to be wary about the phrases that you hear in public, such as follow the science. Now, I don't often confess this. I want to say again, I did get my confirmation at the right time, but when I first entered the university many moons ago, I studied physics. Like Socrates, I thought I was going to find the answers in physics, and then other things intervened along the way. So I haven't kept up with much of the science in the meantime, but I think I know what science is, and I think I know what the scientific method is. And properly speaking, as we know, science is value neutral, and it's by its very nature, it cannot lead us anywhere. People can tell us to follow it, but science does not take us anywhere. It's we human beings who do science. Science informs us about certain data, but we have to lead that data with wisdom and with humility, because we know only too well. And we've learned in particular this year that perhaps a lab in Wuhan, China, we've learned from that science can be used for foolish purposes, corrupt purposes, used by ambitious people for disastrous ends. And let me say, as somebody who's lived 30 years in Washington, I haven't even gotten to the politicians yet. I've spent this past year as the inaugural St. John Henry Newman visiting chair. I have to tell William again that the very name was intriguing when he first invited me, because I've loved Newman for so long and had to discover him myself on an Ivy League campus when I was an undergraduate. I'd urge all of you to stay close to him, because he's not only a great genius, a great stylist, a holy man, but he's just someone worth pondering again and again and again. I reread his sermons frequently, and I feel as if I've never read them before. They're so rich that every rereading gives you something important. But I often find myself going back to just a couple of words that Newman once spoke, that for me, perhaps kind of sum up the impact that he's had on me. And it's this. Newman once said, quite simply, that we need an increment of soul. Those three words, an increment of soul, a growth of the soul, in other words, properly to use the power that science and technology, and now medical sciences, of course, have placed in our hands. We as Catholics have the better ethical arguments on matters like abortion, the dignity of all human life, and how medical research should be conducted in a moral fashion. But as somebody who's actually been engaged in trying to make arguments for Catholic principles in public for the last 30, maybe even 40 years at this point, I have to say that I think we may have been unsuccessful. We've been somewhat successful, but we are somewhat unsuccessful, maybe because we don't have that growth of soul. That though we know and we can make theoretical arguments, maybe we don't convince, because heart speaks to heart, another phrase from Newman, soul speaks to soul. And I think as we develop that more, the arguments themselves, which are so strong, will be more successful. And that increment of soul is something that I want to issue as a challenge to all of you graduating today and everyone who's here, because we live in a world that we know is constantly becoming more and more secular, as the bishop said, trying to live without God, and not only wants to do that for itself, but wants to impose on the rest of us a way of living that is not only without God, but that contradicts what we know to be the heart of what God wants for us. We follow the science to be informed, but the science must follow wisdom if it's to produce goods for us. There's another challenge in the so-called real world that I want to put before you. And so I was thinking about how to put it. It reminded me of that old saying that idle hands are the devil's workshop. There's probably no better explanation for why it is during this current pandemic that our whole country got woke. Thomas More College people know the term woke? Where am I? Now, when people are not at school, people are not doing their normal jobs, they're going to find ways to do other things because the way we are built, we are passionate moral beings. And if we can't express our moral passions about true moral goods, and I would put among those respect for life, family, marriage, the sanctity of human life from birth to natural death, as we are often say. If you can't, or you're prevented by your culture from speaking passionately in public about those things, you're going to want to speak passionately about something else that you regard as a moral good. And I have to say, I know this may sound somewhat simplistic, but I really believe that that's the basic explanation for why these rather odd new moral crusades have emerged among us. I made a quick list of some of them. I won't bore you too much, but I'm sure you've all heard plenty this past year about systemic racism, white privilege, white fragility, anti-racist racism, transgenderism. Transgenderism is the human rights issue of our time, according to our Catholic president. Non-binary sexual identities, novel pronouns, identifying as something other, despite your biology, and the ferocious moral cancellation that takes place whenever someone stands up against these newly discovered moral crusades. Now, the moral truth that exists in that list of subjects that I just read out, the moral goods that are there are some moral things to aim at in each of those categories, but they're minimal. They certainly are not worthy of this sort of overweening, passionate cancellation, banishment, excommunication of people that we see in our culture. And there's an even deeper manifestation of woke. We were able, during this past year here at Thomas More College, to have a podcast on Columbus Day, because I've written a couple of books about Columbus. It's kind of one of my minor passions. And I've noticed over the years that Columbus went from being the sailor who sailed the ocean blue in 1492 to being a proxy for our Christian culture and for our Western and American culture. So that what happens when a figure like Columbus is attacked, and I'm not exaggerating when I say this, is not that we are coming to a better understanding of the good and bad as there is in all of us in the case of Columbus. What's happened, in fact, is that this is a manifestation of that spirit, of that anti-Christian and anti-American and anti-even Western spirit that's sort of come to the fore. And the clearest way that you see that is in the way that in many places, in my county, in Virginia, Fairfax County, Columbus Day has now been replaced with Indigenous Peoples Day. Now, in writing about Columbus, I've studied Indigenous peoples. Many Indigenous cultures are quite worthy of being celebrated, but not all of them. Indigenous peoples were human beings as we are, with their mixes of good and bad, and some of them are worth celebrating and some of them are not. But the fact that kind of uncritically, we just abandon one of the figures who brought to these continents our Christian religion, and he was a very serious Christian, Christian values, many of the cultural achievements of the West, the fact that we abandon that for an amorphous idea of indigenous peoples about whom most people know absolutely nothing, tells you, in my estimation, that we're not just having a corrective of something in our culture, we're having something being canceled and replaced. So my latest book is actually called Columbus and the Crisis of the West. And again, I don't think that's an exaggeration. I think that what we see in the way he's being treated, and others, when we start to cancel Abraham Lincoln or Washington or Jefferson, of course we don't celebrate people for the bad parts of their character. But we do celebrate them because they are great persons in other ways as well. Just as we don't cancel our family or friends or acquaintances because they're imperfect. But of course, we only do that if we recognize, as Christians must, that we ourselves are imperfect. That just as we expect to be respected and valued for the good things that we try to do, others, past and present, deserve the same respect that we would like to have for ourselves. And again, this form of wokeness, it seems to me, is it kind of speaks to the fact that the culture that we have right now has lost those old Christian ideas that we are fallen creatures, that we all sin and make mistakes, and therefore mercy, forgiveness, mutual forbearance, appreciation of the good in others, all these things are necessary if we have the barest hope to be able to live together on this earth. So the remedy for wokeness, I believe, after many years of doing public Catholicism, and by the way, the remedy for this, I think, depends more on the increment of soul and the manner in which we do this than it does about the specifics, as important as the specifics are. And this is another challenge I will issue to the graduating class, as I do to myself these days as a public writer almost every day. And that is, how do we respond? And we must respond forcefully, truthfully, and charitably to this woke culture that seeks to cancel our own Christian culture. How do we respond to that without, in our own ways, turning out like that culture? Because if we start canceling others because of their points of view, and those points of view may be in very sharp disagreement with our own, if we start canceling others, banishing others, we've adopted their manner. And in the long run, that will not survive. Cancel culture cannot survive. But look, my time here comes to an end, and I hope to be here at other times with you. But one final challenge to the class of 2021. A challenge that I've taken to heart myself these years. St. Francis of Assisi, one of the great charismatic figures in our tradition, used to often say to the early friars, "Let us begin again, for as yet we have done nothing." Now, of course, the early Franciscans had already done a great deal, and Francis was not a liar. But what he was saying is that we never come to the end. We never rest on our laurels. We never think we're all that, because even if we've done miraculous things because of the holiness and the accomplishments that the Franciscans were able to achieve. He was a down-to-earth type. He knew what he was talking about. I might put it this way. He knew that every day was a day of commencement, that always beginning again is not something that we should find as an unending frustration, but as the perpetual openness to greater understanding, sympathy, compassion, mercy, and love. And those of us who live every day as a commencement day will never lack for meaning and purpose and great vistas spread out before our eyes. That's a lifelong and a more than a lifelong task, as I'm sure you all know after the time you've spent studying here. It's wonderful, highly human, and it's a holy prospect. So once again, I commend you to this exciting commencement of another phase of your lives. And I especially wish you all Godspeed in each and every one of your future endeavors. Thank you.